Hi, folks. This is Mark by Mark A. Foster, Ph.D., for the Institute for Dialectical Metarealism. The Mexica movement is a California-based organization which contends that all Mexicans are, perhaps by definition, indigenous. Now, I had never considered that before, but I am not Mexican. I live now 2 miles from Mexico, but 2 miles from Mexico is an eternity when you consider the differences in social class, education, power, which exist between those two countries. And so I have been reflecting on the Mexica movement. I don't know whether all Mexicans would agree with it. I would assume not. I mean, it is hard to get people of any nationality or group into a place where they would agree on everything. But still, the idea is novel, and I think it is potentially emancipating because not only are Mexicans third world or developing, but if the Mexica movement is accurate, Mexico is also a land of indigenous people. Here is what I had always thought in the past, that like the United States, there were indigenous people in Mexico. Certainly that is something which is observable. Even when I travel down to Mexico myself, I see people who are ostensibly indigenous. But then you have the Spaniards, who I thought of as not being indigenous. And then you have the descendants of the African Americans. And yes, there are descendants of African Americans in Mexico. They are runaway slaves. But from the perspective of the Mexica movement, all of them, to some extent, have intermarried with indigenous Mexicans. And so, if that is true, then all Mexicans are, by default, indigenous peoples. What a wonderful idea. As someone who loves indigeneity, as someone who wishes that he was an indigenous person, and I wish that very deeply, sincerely, I wish it all the time. As a U.S. citizen, I especially wish that I were Lakota Sioux, because I admire the Lakota Sioux, the tradition of the white buffalo calf woman, and the concept of two-spirited people, which exists among the Lakota Sioux, but which has more recently been adopted by other Native American nations and tribes as well. But I suppose I thought of Mexico in that sense as being like the United States. There are people of different ethnicities, tribes are among them, nations are among them, but not all Americans are certainly indigenous. I know my ancestry. I know that my parents came from Europe. I know what countries in Europe as Ashkenazi Jews they came from. And so I feel that for myself, I could never justifiably say that I was an indigenous person. To me, as an American, to do so would be to show enormous disrespect to the indigenous Native Americans, Inuit, and Native Hawaiians here in the United States. But Mexico is a different country, and I do not pretend to understand it. So I'm not going to impose my own perspectives as a U.S. citizen upon Mexico. Apparently, the people who started this organization in California have no problem regarding all Mexicans as being indigenous, and they refer to the Mexican people as Mexica. I would suggest that you go to the website, which I have linked directly below this video, and read through it yourself. And I think you will be pleasantly surprised, amazed, pleased by what you see there. I know that was my reaction. Again, I wish I would have heard of the Mexica movement years ago. I really do, because it would have given me an entirely different perspective on Mexico than the one I have now. I have always had enormous respect for Mexicans, enormous respect. I see them, along with Central Americans, as the forgotten people, in a sense, the subaltern of North America. But as a Maoist third worldist, adding that additional dimension of Mexica to Mexican Americans completes the picture, in my view. It shows that Mexicans and Mexican Americans are all, according to them, indigenous people. Now, I should point out that I have never met or spoken with anybody who is a part of that movement. I have also never asked a Mexican or a Mexican American whether he or she has heard of it or whether he or she agrees with it. I don't know. So I don't want to make any prejudgments, not having had any associations with people who are Mexican and having discussed the subject with them. But I'm sure I will eventually, especially now that I have been thinking about it more. Did I just discover it today? No. I discovered it about 3 months ago, but I was working on some other projects, so I guess I put it on the back burner. But I kind of rediscovered it today. And I was so pleased by it that I felt inspired to make this episode of my podcast devoted entirely to the Mexica movement. For as a Maoist third worldist, as someone who loves the third world, and as someone who loves the fourth world, that additional area of importance that is added to Mexicans and to Mexican Americans is wonderful, absolutely wonderful in my view. Where I live, most people are Mexican Americans. Some are transplants from Mexico, but most are Mexican Americans. And then there are the rest of us who are immigrants to this area from the Midwest, from the Northeast, from the West Coast, or elsewhere. In other words, we are not native to this area. I have often been disturbed when I have heard people, in response to my statement that most people here speak Spanish, and many poor Mexicans here speak only Spanish, that why should they do that? Don't they know that they are in America? How disgusting. Don't they know that there is no official language in the United States? There isn't. I mean, English is the de facto language in the United States, the language that most people speak. And certainly, if you want to be successful in most parts of the US, if you do not know English, you will have a hard time doing it. So there is an incentive for immigrants to learn English, but that is it. English is not the official language of the US. In that sense, the US and Canada, for example, are very different. In Canada, French and English are the official languages of Canada. So French, for example, being spoken very widely in Quebec, and English spoken in the rest of the provinces and territories. And of course, some of the Inuit languages, like Inuktitut, being spoken in some of the northern territories. But it is still disappointing when I hear my fellow Americans talk about English as if somehow it has some inherent right to be regarded as the indigenous language of the United States, when English was not the language of the indigenous people in the United States. If anything should be an indigenous language, it should be the languages of the Native Americans. That aside, if we consider the United States since colonialism, when people from Spain, people from Britain, and other places migrated to the United States, they came from all different parts of those countries and from other countries as well. And that is what established Spanish and English as, perhaps you might say, indigenous languages in the United States, although I am always reluctant to use that term, because whenever I think of indigenous, I think of Native Americans, of the Inuit people, and of Native Hawaiians. It is hard for me to conceive of a native or indigenous language as being anything but a language spoken by one of the Aboriginal inhabitants of what is now the United States. And yet, I am willing to make an adjustment. I guess that would be the right term for it, an adjustment. And for the sake of this particular topic, but not universally, to regard English and Spanish as co-native languages of the United States, meaning languages that were spoken by the colonists, by the colonizers, both Spanish and English. Even without the Spanish-American War, there would be plenty of Spanish-speaking people in the United States. But the Spanish-American War put the seal on it. And now, huge sectors of the United States are populated by Mexicans, Americans, and especially here in the Rio Grande Valley, where despite being very patriotic Americans, these people who make up the bulk of the population in the area in which I live are, according to the Mexica movement, natives. They are indigenous. They should be seen as indigenous people to the Americas. And that is fine with me. Because when I hear the term, I am a Native American, as many white people say, or even I am a native New Yorker, as I sometimes say, and when I reflect back on it, and I think, Did they have a right to say that? Do I have a right to say that I am a Native American when people like the Iroquois inhabited my state of birth, before the colonialists arrived on the North American continent? And I must say that I really don't have a satisfactory answer to that question. I wish I did. I've tried, but I really can't come up with an answer that pleases me completely. And so for now, at least for now, I will be content with the views that are presented by the Mexica movement, that Mexican Americans and Mexicans in general are indigenous people. They are among the indigenous people of the Americas and should be regarded as such. Part of that is because inevitably, no matter where you are in Mexico, you inevitably intermarried with somebody who was an indigenous person, with somebody who was what we would call here an American Indian, I guess a Mexican Indian. And so that would make you indigenous. How splendid. Taking that idea of indigeneity as it was developed by the indigenous people in Mexico and expanding it to include other people in Mexico who may not look indigenous, but who perhaps inevitably have some indigenous ancestry and therefore should be regarded in the views of the Mexica movement as indigenous. Again, that would not work very well in the US, because the US is a more divided society. We are more of a patchwork quilt, I guess, or a jigsaw puzzle. We really are a country that is divided with itself. We have so many nationalities, so many ethnicities, that it is hard to say what the US is. But if I can say one thing with confidence, it is that I am not an indigenous American. But if I were from Mexico, if I were born in Mexico, the Mexica movement is saying that most likely, or perhaps inevitably, I would have had indigenous ancestry somewhere in my past. And that would make me Mexica. That would make me an indigenous person in Mexico. How wonderful. That's the word that keeps on coming to me. Wonderful. How pleasant. How sublime. I feel proud in a sense. I don't mean proud in any kind of arrogant sense, but I feel proud to be 2 miles from Mexico, a land of indigeneity and a land of indigenous and fourth worldism. For the time being, this has been Mark by Mark A. Foster, Ph.D., for the Institute for Dialectical Metarealism. Have a pleasant day and an even better day tomorrow.